As you said, my name is Stephen Fluin. I am a developer advocate here on the Angular team at Google. I've actually personally spent a bunch of time in Sofia, so Dobro večer. I used to work at a company you guys probably know, MentorMate, which is a big IT company, but I left something like 3-4 years ago at this point. And I've been at Google for the last 2 years. Before that, I was at Trello. So my whole role at Google is really centered around two things. First is help developers be successful with Angular. And second, understand what it's like to be a developer out in the real world so that we can make the right sort of product decisions along the way. I've been involved personally kind of with Telerik for a little bit now. We are looking at ways of integrating NativeScript into Angular a little bit more seamlessly, looking at ways at making the experience better. So I'm a big fan of NativeScript. I actually have my NativeScript shirt on today, so superhero underneath. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about progressive web applications. So how many people here know what a PWA is? Okay, about half the group. So I'll try and keep that part a little bit lighter, but feel free to stop me if anyone says I'm going too fast. Let's present the screen here. All right, so today's goal, I want to share both the ease of building progressive web applications as well as the potential that comes with these things. But before we do that, I think it's really important to have a little bit of context. So I say to a lot of people that right now is a great time to be an Angular developer. The platform itself has achieved a very high level of stability. Since the kind of 2.0.0 release back in September of 2016, we've been doing these 6-month release cycles where we change the number, but we don't really change what Angular is under the hood. And so we're really focused on investing a lot of time and energy to make sure that every update to Angular is easy and beneficial to developers. So every time you don't have to rewrite your code, but we make some changes behind the scenes that make things better. We saw this in the last couple of version releases, and this is something that you're going to see in future releases as well. And the other half of that is we don't want to just stay static. We don't want to just be mature and not change, right? Because the web as a platform continues to change. There's cool new technologies that come out every day. And so if we can achieve this kind of magical balance between stability, where you write Angular code, you build Angular applications, and they're going to continue working today and tomorrow and the day after that. But then we also want to be able to take advantage of innovation, where if, for example, a new technology like WebAssembly means that we can all build applications with better performance, because we, as the Angular team, kind of want to own the entire developer experience and really take this platform approach. We own the build system, we own the compiler. That means we can, if it makes sense, turn those things on for you or make it easy to turn those things on. And so this is something that we've seen kind of over and over with different features now, where we have an idea, we first make it theoretically possible, and then we add it to the platform directly, and then we make it easy, and then someday we make it automatic. And so when we talk about progressive web applications, I think this is a really great example of how there's a lot of Angular applications today that don't take advantage of PWAs, but it's very easy to opt in. And this is something that we're making it even easier over time to opt into, with the theory being that if it makes sense for all developers to use PWAs, we'll opt everyone into those things. So I'm going to go through this in a few short sections. So first, I want to reflect on some of the ecosystem and in terms of the choices that we have to build these sorts of applications. Then I'm going to talk specifically about PWAs, make sure that we're all at the same place. Then I want to do a demo of adding a PWA to features to one of my applications, or adding a service worker to an application. Then I want to just do a brief summary of the tools that are involved in some of the Angular tooling that we've got going. And then I'll end with reflecting a little bit on the future in terms of what the team is hoping to add and bring to developers. So let's start by reflecting a little bit. Every user uses a different device in a different way. I've traveled a lot and been to a lot of conferences, and the numbers are kind of staggering to me, where if you think about the usage of desktop web versus mobile web actually ends up being huge. And so having a web application that performs really well both in desktop experiences as well as laptop and mobile experiences is really important, because I know a lot of us are using our phones constantly. The numbers I've seen, for example, in China, it's 90% of web usage comes from mobile devices. In the US, it's something like 70%, just based on some of the data I've seen. I don't know if these numbers are particularly good, but I saw on Reddit, this is not sourced at all. I think I saw on Reddit this morning that something like 89% of Facebook's revenue comes from mobile. And these are kind of staggering numbers because it means that the screen and the experience that we have as developers when we're building these applications doesn't match what our users have. And so progressive web applications are really an attempt to react to that in a lot of different ways. And so when I talk about just kind of mobile, there's a lot of good ways to build mobile applications. One way that I think everyone in this room is probably very familiar with it, native script. So this is the idea that we can take the existing Angular layer, leave all the change detection, dependency injection, leave all of those things in place and run them in the pure kind of JavaScript virtual machine. But then instead of rendering to HTML and instead of rendering to the browser, we actually render to native widgets. And so that's something that native script is very good at and is right for building experiences when you need a installed application that's using native widgets or interacting with native devices. One of my favorite parts about native script is that it has this giant plugin library, this marketplace where you can go get additional tools, which is very, very good. There's also other strategies like Ionic, where instead of rendering to the native layer, we're actually rendering just a web view in our application. You can do this with Cordova as well. But one of the nice things about Ionic or those sorts of technologies is that you get an installed application with a high degree of code sharing between your web application and your installed application. But more and more, what we see is that companies can't just ship a native mobile experience or an installed mobile experience. You still have to ship a web application. And so the idea is that if we can take advantage of new APIs and make our web applications the best possible and maximize the code sharing with these between the mobile experience and the web experience, our users are going to end up benefiting from that. So let's dive into PWA. So a PWA isn't really anything special. This is just a term we've given to a new class of applications that theoretically are better for users. And they're better for users in three ways. So we're talking about applications that render quickly. So this is both initial boot time as well as change detection. So we talk about a metric called time to interactive. So this is between when the user starts loading your page and when they can actually do something meaningful and productive. Minimizing that amount of time is really important. And I think we've all seen statistics about how the speed of loading of our application dramatically affects the amount of conversions we have, the amount of user satisfaction we have. But we're also talking about building reliable experiences because if 90% of our web traffic is coming from these mobile devices, what happens when they're on the subway? What happens when they are traveling, when they're on a plane, those sorts of things. These were traditionally not something we thought about as part of the web, right? We were thinking about wired connections, Wi-Fi connections, but as more and more web usage moves to mobile, we need to care about that reliability. And then the last piece is engaging. How can we build a web application that isn't as transactional, right? One of the best things about the web is that with no foresight, no install, I can visit a web page and engage in a transaction. I can buy something, I can send something. And this is kind of the magic of the web. But then what happens after that? How do I build a more engaging experience as I start to develop a relationship with my users? There's a few technologies under the hood when we talk about PWAs. The first and probably the simplest to add is called a web app manifest. And I'll talk a little bit about this. The second is a service worker. And I'll kind of go into that in depth because this is where the meat of the functionality is. But then the last piece about progressive web applications is really building great applications, right? All of the tooling, all of the APIs in the world don't matter if your application takes 30 seconds to load because you're not code splitting, or if you're entering infinite loop, or if you don't have high code quality, or your design is not optimized for that user's device. And so it's really the combination of these technology side of things, but also building better applications that really makes these apps that are more engaging, more reliable for users. So I talked a little bit about the web app manifest. So this is a file that you're going to store on the file system. It's JSON. And then what you can do is you link to this from the HTML. Historically, when we were in a server-side rendered world, you had a collection of pages, and it didn't matter where they were being rendered. It didn't matter how they got to the user's device. They could be coming from different servers, different application layers, but they weren't actually connected beyond being on a domain or a subdomain together. There was no indication that these were part of a whole. So now with the rise of single page applications and this idea of a web application as opposed to just a website or a web page, we now have a manifest file that lets browsers and devices know that this isn't a full application with kind of multiple parts. We do this in a couple ways. So first, we can give some kind of basic information about this. So what's the site name? What's the description? Those sorts of things. We can also determine how this should render. So one of the things you can do is you can say this application works best starting at this URL. So I've got slash here, but one of the very common things I see is that people will throw, for example, a UTM source into this URL. So they're still going to hit the index page, but they're going to hit it with a Google Analytics verifiable tag that says, hey, I can track how many of my users are coming from my PWA. And that's actually a really big deal because one of the companies that's implemented PWAs with Angular is a company called ShopStyle. So it's a large retail company. What they saw was that users that engaged with the same website, the same web application, but the users that came from the installed home screen spent twice as much. So it doesn't matter how big that group is, right? If you have users that are spending twice as much, that is a huge win. And we can also do things like, do I want to show the URL bar? Do I want the standalone? Is this an application that works better in portrait or landscape? And the last thing that is really nice is that you can do theming and styling. So by adding the simple manifest, when you load it on a browser that supports it, you'll get this very nice branded colored bar that makes the web, even if they don't install it to their device, it makes the web more engaging place where I get this visual confirmation that I am where I want to be and that this is a cohesive experience. Another nice thing of building a web app manifest is that the Chrome browser has these web app install banners. So using a heuristic to say, does this user actually care about this page? And this changes over time. I think right now it's has the user access the page on multiple occasions and engage with it for more than X time. You get this very nice pop-up that says, do you want to install this application to your home screen? And so this is a way of taking these transactional engagement interactions and turning them into a much richer experience. The nice thing is if you look at, for example, Android Oreo, not only do you get an application on the home screen, but you also get it in the launcher. So you get this app-like experience directly from a website. All right, so we talked a little bit about the web app manifest. Now let's talk about the service worker. So the service worker under the hood is very much like a web worker. It's actually a subset of web workers, but I like to think of it as a web worker on steroids, where we get an additional thread where we can write and run code, but we get access to all of these different APIs. The first API that's kind of very important is the idea that this is an installable worker. So unlike normal applications where the user has to visit it and then we go pull it off the internet in order to run anything, this is actually installable to the user's device. There's an entire life cycle there that does that. But now this thing lives on the user's computer, so it can be fast, so it can kind of proceed with them. There's a really interesting URL that you can go to. It's chrome://service worker-internals. Or you can just open the dev tools and go to the service worker or applications tab and then click on service worker. And it's really interesting to look on kind of people's browsers or have them look on their own and see all of the different applications that are already installing service workers to their devices. Because the average person I've talked to already has 10 service workers installed onto their computer without really them needing to know about that at all, because the browsers enforce a really strict and regimented security policy so that we're not violating user trust by installing something on their computer. Service workers can also act as a network proxy. So because this is installed locally, I can actually intercept and respond to any of the network requests coming from my application, whether that's my index.html page, whether that's some dynamic URL that I want to interact with. Third is caching. So if we're going to be proxying network requests, we need to be really good at caching, so storing files and then responding with those files. The last thing that the service worker allows you to do is you can actually register for push notifications. So your service worker can be woken up by a remote process that you send a ping to the server, and that will actually show up on the phone as a notification if the user is not engaging with the application. Or if the user is engaging with the application, you can intercept that notification and do something else with it, right? Maybe reset the state of the application, re-render the screen, whatever you want to do. There's a bunch of different browsers that support Service Worker. So today, Firefox and Chrome are the main browsers for that. But we've actually seen really, really good adoption from the other browsers in the last few months. So it's coming to both the next version of Edge, it's coming out with the next version of Windows, as well as it's in Safari, iOS Safari. So this was not something that was certain for a long time. We weren't actually sure what Apple was going to do with service workers on this open spec, but it looks like they started implementing, they started adopting. So very soon, right, we already have 74% of global web usage. But very soon, probably in the next few months, we should see that every major evergreen browser has service worker support. And that's really something to celebrate because it makes right now a really good time to build these sorts of applications. There's also talk about PWAs getting additional visibility. And so one of the most public ones of these is actually coming out of Microsoft. So they have, as of, I think, February 6th, said, we are going to be using the Bing crawler to crawl the entire internet. And whenever we find a PWA, we're going to automatically put it in the Windows Store. Zdrasty. Which is kind of a very magical thing because this is one of the first and the biggest indications that our progressive web applications are being treated like applications, right? And being put on the same tier, on the same, held to the same standards as a normal desktop or mobile application. All right, so now I'm going to get into a bit of a demo. So I'm sure something will go wrong, but please bear with me. So we're going to switch over here, and I'm going to jump first to the terminal. Oh, I got to wave my arms around so the lights don't go out here. All right, so there's a couple ways to build a PWA with Angular. So I can do ng new, and I can give it an application name, and then I can say -- service -- worker. And that's going to scaffold out a full application with a service worker, right? So if I already did this just to skip the install step, it looks like a normal Angular CLI application. If I go into source, I'm going to see all of this works exactly as normal. But I actually think that that's a little bit less interesting because most of us already have Angular applications and we want to do something with that and actually add service worker to an existing Angular application. So I think ng new -- service worker is a really important way to look at an example if you want code. But I'm actually going to do something a little bit more daring, and I'm going to go into ng Sofia. And so this is a brand new ng new application that I scaffolded out about 20 minutes ago. So I have not modified this. This is just from scratch. And if I type ng serve, what we should see here is just a normal hello world application coming from Angular. And then we can see the source code here. So we've got normal CLI things, source/app is where all our interesting things are. You can see a blank app module, app component, and default. So that looks like that was running. So let's just do this. All right, so localhost 4200. If we look over on the application tab where you're going to find all the information about service workers, I do not have any sort of service worker installed right now. So let's go ahead and build out a little bit of a real application. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my app module and I'm going to import HTTP client module so that we can fetch some data from the internet. How many people have switched from HTTP to HTTP client? Okay, a couple of you. HTTP client, cannot recommend it enough. It is smaller on your bundle size. It has new features like typings that come out of the box. It has interceptors, so we made it smaller, better, easier to use. It cannot recommend it enough. It's really easy, and you'll see here how easy it is to use. All right, so we'll import the HTTP client module, and now we'll jump into our application, and let's actually fetch some data. So we'll just kill all of this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to download some data from GitHub, and then I'm going to go from there and render that out to the screen. So let's just say repositories. Let's define a variable, and let's just check that this is working here real quick. So obviously that doesn't exist yet. And this is the API that I'm going to be pulling. So this is just a publicly available GitHub API that tells us all the repos that have the name Angular in them. All right, so let's define a variable called repositories in my app component. And then let's say constructor. We want HTTP client. And now we're going to say this .repositories equals http.get. We'll just give it a path. Oops. All right. Let's give this a type too, and we've got a bug already. Oh, I do not want the Selenium WebDriver version. That should work a little bit better. All right, so now we are fetching data. We are creating an observable called this.repositories, and we're fetching the data. So if we switch over here, here is my localhost 4200. We get null back because we have no data to render. and then we get this full set of information. So you'll note this is an object and actually not a list. I want the items property. So I'm going to just say import map from RxJS operators. You'll notice I'm going to be using the new pipeable or lettable operators. How many people have moved to the pipeable or lettable operators? That guy who's also moved to HTTP client. They are better. So they're better in a couple ways. So you don't have side effects, which is a really important thing where you make a change in one part of your application and the rest of your application ends up being wrong unintentionally. So the lettable operators do everything locally, so you don't have that. They're also going to, again, result in smaller bundle sizes. All right, so what I'm going to say is this.repositories equals this.map. We'll say object goes to object.items. And we're going to use pipeable operators, so we're going to say pipe.
Hey, Steven, sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you to switch to a lighter theme so that we can see the code a little bit better?
Maybe.
Yeah, we can see it, but it will be better if it's a lighter theme.
Do you have a preference? Visual Studio?
Yeah. Oh, that's perfect. Thanks.
Oh, see, that's why no one switched to the lettable operators, because the theme. All right. So we've now fetched our items. So instead of a big giant object, we now have a big giant list. So let's actually do something a little bit less terrible with this list. So I'm going to say ng4 equals let repo of repositories. And then we can say async, because this is coming from an observable. And then I should be able to say something like repo.name. And we'll see if I got that variable right. There it is. Now we have a beautiful list of repositories coming from GitHub. Hooray, it worked. We have a working application. It's pulling data from the internet. All right, so now I'm going to do two things. So first, I'm going to add a tiny little micro kind of manual caching layer to this. So I've got an HTTP request. I'm going to add another operator called start with. And because this is a small kind of demo application, I'm going to store all of this data in a cache that lives in local storage. So I'm going to say this.repositories.subscribe. And then every time we get a new item coming back from the HTTP request, I'm going to say local storage repo cache equals JSON.stringify next. So what this will do is anytime we successfully get a response back from the HTTP server, I'm going to stringify it and store it into local storage. And people always ask, why is HTTP giving you an observable if it's going to resolve 0 or 1 times? And I find that the start with operator is actually a really great example of this. So I can say this.repositories start with, and then I can actually give it that local storage copy. So I'm going to say local JSON.parse local storage repo cache. And if we don't have anything in the repo cache, let's just give it an empty object. Just give it a list. All right, I am probably missing some things here. Oh, there we go. All right, so what we've done is we've created a new observable, and we actually need to assign it. So this.repositories equals. So we're creating a derivative observable of our HTTP request that says, hey, if you don't have data, or even if you do have data, just go and get that from local storage. So what will happen now is synchronously, our application will load first from local storage, and then asynchronously, as soon as that network request completes, we'll get the real version. So you'll see when I hit refresh now, there's no waiting period where we see null. We get the user's old data, and then it refreshes to the new data. And so I find this to be a really powerful, really easy cache mechanism that you can put anywhere in your application and really take advantage of operators like start with, so you don't have any kind of churn in your application when it's loading. So up till now, this has just been a very basic Angular application that fetches data, and now we have a little bit of a cache layer. So let's start making this into a progressive web application by adding a service worker on top of it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to drop down into my shell, and I'm going to say yarn add at angular/service-worker. This should go very quickly. I'll just install the latest version the Angular tooling for service workers. And then back in VS Code, what this should give me is a new module. So I should be able to import service worker module from that Angular/service worker. And then we can import this. So the API for this is we're going to want to call register, and we're going to give it two things. We're going to give it the file name of the built service worker. So on the CLI, this is going to be /ngsw-worker.js. You can put this wherever you want if you're manually building a service worker. I recommend just using whatever the CLI gives you. And then the second thing we want to do is I'm going to say environment enabled is equal to environment.production. So this is a variable that's an environmental variable that comes from the CLI, where if we're in development, production is false, and if we're in production, production is true. And so this will actually get swapped out. Basically, environment.ts exists no matter how you do your build, and then what its contents are depend on the build type. And so the nice thing here is that you get access to the service worker module, but it's only going to register the service worker if you're in production. And the reason we do that is because you don't really want a service worker in development. You obviously need to verify and validate that your service worker works, but you don't want it in development because it breaks the standard kind of refresh cycle. So every time I hit save in a file, the application is going to reload those files. And if the application is coming from a service worker instead of from disk, I'm always going to be kind of one version behind, which is not ideal as developers. It would make our lives a little bit more complicated. All right, so we are registering the service worker now, and now we have to do two more things. So I need to let the Angular CLI know that I would like a service worker. So I'm going to say service worker true. And then the other thing that I need to do is I need a configuration file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cd into the source folder, and I'm going to copy a config file that I have laying around. This actually just came from the default ng new -- service worker version. So let's see if we can refresh that. There it is. So you'll see here, this is just a stock version. It's going to look for the static index.html favicon.ico files. It's going to go and try and cache all of the bundle files as well as any chunks. And then we will lazily install, so after the initial setup, cache any of the assets in the assets folder. So this is a reasonable default, and I'll talk you through a couple other examples in a little bit. So now that we have that, we should be able to ng serve here. And what we should see, oops. I always write TypeScript JSON, and that never works. So let's get rid of our trailing comma. Wouldn't that be nice if JSON allowed trailing commas? Someone should go implement that. All right, so we're just going to run ng serve, and I'm going to show that the application still works. So this is dev mode. So this does not have a service worker, so the site can't be found. There it is. No service worker installed. And now instead of doing that from ng serve, I'm going to go ahead and say ng build-prod. And so this should actually now build a service worker and include it as part of my production build of my application. And we can verify that relatively quickly here. And while that's building, I'm actually going to go here and delete. I was doing some tests earlier. All right, so nothing on localhost 8000. This should finish relatively quickly. And what we're going to do is we're going to cd into the dist folder, and we're going to see that the service worker was included. Someone was talking about making t-shirts that say 92% chunk asset optimization. I think that would be pretty funny. All right, so we can cd into our dist file. We're going to see ngsw JSON. So what this file is it's taken our ngsw config and it's added in all the actual files that were rendered by Webpack. So we know the real files. And then you can see we've got ngsw-worker.js, which hopefully was the file name that we typed and told it to register. And if I do something like serve this on a HTTP server, so this is just a Python's HTTP server that's built in, localhost 8000, and it's registering a service worker. And so that means if I take the application offline, and I can't actually do this because I'm remotely presenting, so I apologize, but all of these files are going to come back from the service worker immediately. So even if I took the tab offline, this application would work, all the data would load instantly. And so We've successfully added a service worker to our application. Now it's all about thinking about caching a little bit more intelligently, or you can do things like explore push notifications. I'm going to jump back here to my slides. Oh, I'll show you one more thing. So if you're ever wondering what's happening under the hood of a service worker, you can actually go into this cache section, and you can see all of both the status of the files in the cache, as well as all of the headers. So you can see, hey, here's the files, here's the contents, here's the headers that they've sent us. So here's the manifest that we've loaded. Here's all the versions for those sorts of things. So this is doing a lot of work under the hood. And one of the really important things to note about the Angular service worker as opposed to a service worker that you might write by hand is we've actually re-implemented the entire service worker lifecycle. So normally as a developer, when I hit refresh, if I have an application open in 2 different tabs, it will install a new service worker, but it won't actually activate it. But because we re-implemented the service worker lifecycle, when you hit refresh, the new service worker will get installed and it will take control immediately, so that the second refresh, even if you have 10 tabs open in developer tools, you'll get exactly what you expect. So we're working hard to try and better match developer expectations as we build out our service worker tooling. All right, so let's go back here and we'll just finish up with some additional content here. So we built an Angular application. We fetched data from the internet. We cached that data locally. We added a service worker, and then we would theoretically try it with reduced connectivity by checking that offline button. So I want to talk briefly about some of the tools that we've included here, but then also some of the tools that you can take advantage of. So obviously the CLI was a big help. So it was what was combining our service worker config file with the actual files that are being rendered from Webpack. So we didn't have to do any of that kind of manual setup, manual configuration. We use the @Angular service worker package. And then as we more broadly think about building PWAs out, you can also think about Angular Universal, which is responsible for server-side rendering of Angular applications. And you can do things like rendering an app shell so that the user gets a fully rendered set of HTML the first time without having to bootstrap any sort of Angular. And so rendering something like an app shell so you get the top of your application, the bottom of your application, or maybe the look and feel of your app without actually any of the data, that can, again, dramatically improve that user experience and give you a more engaged audience. We talked about NGSW config a little bit, but basically there's 2 types of configs that you should care about here. So asset groups. So these are files that should be fetched kind of in their entirety. So we do that with all of our HTML, our JavaScript, any of the files in our assets folder. You can also cache third-party files. So for example, I'm also pulling in things on a lot of sites like custom fonts. And so I want those to be available offline as well. And so I'll include these here in the URL section. The second type of cache that we've got is in the data group section. So here what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, here's a URL that as soon as the browser fetches this URL, I want to cache that data. And so what's really nice about this is, for example, this is a set of icons and images coming from the server. I don't necessarily want to cache all of the icons on the entire server, right? That would be crazy depending on how much content we have and depending on what the user browses. And this will cache any of the icons or assets that the user actually hits. So after they first load the page, we see that they've hit these 17 icons or images. We're going to cache those, and then we have complete control over what sort of cache we want. So how much space do we want to use for this cache? How long do we want to keep the cache around? And you can also do things like decide whether you want to optimize for freshness, where we always want to try and make a network request. And if that network request fails, then we fall back to a cache. Or we can optimize for performance, where instead of going to the network first, we're going to go to our cache first and risk the user seeing some out-of-date content so that they get that faster experience. So this is all done in the NGSW config folder. Another really interesting tool that a lot of developers don't know about is whenever you have the Angular service worker installed, you can go to /NGSW/state. And what this will do is this will actually show you the current state of the service worker. So a little bit of a log in terms of what is installed, what is uninstalled, what caches has it applied, as well as it will show you when it last updated. It'll show you what manifest it's operating off of. And so this is actually really helpful for understanding beyond the dev tools, understanding what our service worker is trying to do at that very moment and what it's been successful at, et cetera. Being in the PWA, being in the web development space, you'll also probably see a couple other tools that I want to acknowledge. So the first is Workbox. So this is a set of tooling for building progressive web applications that is from the Chrome team, and it's framework or JavaScript agnostic. So if you have a generic single page application or web application that you want to start creating a PWA and start adding a service worker to, Workbox, you basically just point out your JavaScript folder and then you run imperative commands that invoke Workbox as opposed to the more declarative style of Angular. And then Workbox was actually written to replace a tool called SW Precache. But it's important to acknowledge SW Precache because this is a tool that's used by a lot of CLIs out there. So if you're using other CLIs, other frameworks, things like that, a lot of those are still using SW Precache under the hood. So it's good to be aware of it. I talked a little bit about this, but I'll just touch on a couple best practices again. So only enable this in development mode. You're going to save yourself a lot of time and energy not having to deal with out of date caches kind of during your development cycle. One of the things that does break developer and user expectations is that the content that they're seeing after loading a web page might not be the latest version. And so there's a lot of kind of clever strategies you can do, and I'll talk about one of them. But a lot of times it just makes sense to prompt users to refresh. So in our service worker module, there's actually an SW update service that tells you whether or not the service worker is up to date and kind of what the current status is, so you can decide whether or not you want to show a dialog to the user. But it's also important to think about what of my application is content and what of my application is code. So when I, in my Angular application, write something as HTML, that's actually code, right? So we have to deploy new JavaScript, we have to deploy a new service worker update in order for the user to get that most recent content. But if, for example, I was pulling in the top banner of an application from a database or from an API, that's content. And so then that doesn't need to be refetched. The user's not going to have to apply a service worker update to see that unless you've made your caches too aggressive, where you're caching it and not clearing that out. I'll end with just some comments about the future and kind of a sneak peek at some of the things that are coming from the Angular team. So we already have this ng new -- service worker, which creates a new application with a service worker, but we want to make it easier to do the steps that I just did kind of manually on a lot of new existing applications. And so there's a new tool that's coming down the pipeline that we're hoping to release in a future version called ng-add. So ng-add uses schematics under the hood, and it operates just like ng-generate, where it will modify an existing application. The idea is I should just be able to run ng-add PWA either to a blank application or to an existing application. So hopefully that will make things even easier for developers that want to opt in and try these tools out. I started off talking about this evolution of a feature within the kind of Angular ecosystem of coming from idea to possible to easy to automatic. The hope is that over time, we're going to do more and more things for you by default. So once we've kind of mastered the idea of developers understanding service workers and the subtle ways they change expectations and user interactions, that would be a really great one to turn on by default. But we already have tools for things like pre-rendering app shells. And then also in kind of every version of Angular, we're looking to make your application smaller so that they bootstrap better and with much smaller bundle sizes. So that's something you can continue to look forward to in future versions of Angular. We use our own service worker tooling on angular.io, our documentation website. And one of the strategies we have is we don't actually show the user when the content is out of date because our content does not change that regularly. But if the service worker has been updated, what we do is on the next click, we will, instead of doing a in single page application redirect, we'll actually do a hard refresh. So if the service worker is out of date and we know there's a new one and we've installed it, on the next click that the user does, it will actually refresh the page, go to the new page, and that will apply the new service worker. And so this is kind of an interesting technique of how you can avoid prompting the user to say, hey, reload the application, which I would say is probably not the greatest user experience, but it's better than looking at the out-of-date page and not knowing what's going on. So I want to thank everyone here, Blagodaria, and I'd be happy to answer questions.